Have you ever sat and stared up at the stars and wondered, where did we come from? Let's take a journey like no other, not to a place, but to a time. Join us as we delve deep into the human past and explore our shared human origins. Welcome to the world of
Hello,
paleoanthropology.
everybody. This is Seth with the World of Paleoanthropology, and today we are going to be discussing the re-release of a book for a new version from one of our guests who's been on a few times, Dr. Agustin Fuentes. I'm going to hand it over to him to tell us a little bit about what this book is, its title, and maybe why you should buy it right off the bat.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me. The book that we're going to talk about, right, is you can see that Race, Monogamy, and Other Lies They Told You, Busting Myths About Human Nature. And this is the second edition. The first one was published in 2012, so I wrote it between like 2009 and 2012. This one I spent about 2.5 years revising. And so it's got about 30% new content, 140 new citations, restructured examples, some new chapters, things like that. But what's the sort of punchline here? The punchline is in the title in one sense, which I made, controversial or flashy just so people would pick it up and look at it. But the basic notion is that there are some very deleterious and damaging myths about race, about sex, and about aggression and their relationship to human nature. And we have the sort of scientific data and the social scientific analyses and the history to know better, right? And to bust those myths and to live better lives by doing so. And I think it's really important that people have access to that information. So the punchline is I wrote the book over a decade ago to sort of push against these myths. And I revised the book substantially now because a lot's happened in the last 10 years. And unfortunately, these myths are just as strong as they were a decade ago and even more in need of being busted.
And that was going to bring me to my first question, and that was, how successful do you think your pushback has been against these?
I mean,
How much successes can there be had in times like this right now?
I don't know, right? I mean, I wish there was a way I could have a conversation with everyone who's read this book after they read it,
Mhm.
right? Or during their
Right.
reading and just have a Q&A. But, I would hope that that some people, at least people who read the book, don't necessarily agree with me. That's not the point, but
Mhm.
that they have a better understanding of what the patterns and processes are of being human in regards to human variation, in regards to the history and currency of racism, in regards to human biology and sex and gender and human biology and aggression and violence. Like if you just have a better grasp on that, then I consider that a win, right?
Mhm.
Is that working? I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of crap out in the world and misinformation that is really challenging people's sort of well-being. And I think a lot of it still circles around these ideas of race, of sex, gender, and of violence and aggression.
Most definitely. And I think, unfortunately, as you mentioned, those patterns are quite plain in our modern day society. Um, and I as well think it's an important goal to not force people to necessarily think the way you think, but just to give
Yeah.
them the information so they
And
can, yeah.
yeah. And to do so, hopefully, in a reasonably clear way. The thing is,
Mhm.
being human is complicated, and everyone wants a clear, cut and dry, you know, race, black, white, these are different things, or sex, gender, right? Sex is biology and gender is culture. It's actually a lot more complicated than that. And I think
Mhm.
if what I try to do in the book is lay out how it's more complicated and how we can think about it in a more effective data-based, evidence-based manner. And I think that's really important. The weird thing is the reactions that I get sometimes from people who get very angry or antagonistic about it, frequently I think because they don't read what I'm actually saying. When I say that sex gender is complicated in a human, or that, it's not, sex gender is not best represented as a binary in human, people lose their minds. It's like, no, you're saying, you're denying biology. I'm like, I'm trained in biology. Would you read the book and see what's going on? And the same with aggression, and especially the same with race and racism. People want
Right.
these simple either or clean explanations. Is that's just not the way the world works.
Right. And I think anyone who has worked in anthropology knows that those things are drastically true. Um, and it's, I applaud you for doing all the work you're doing for this pushback. And I do dream of a world where, this information is widely available and people understand it. I just don't think we're there yet. And I think it's going to be a little bit, but revisions of books like this that you wrote, what did you say? It was 2012 or
2012 is
something?
when it first came out.
2012.
Yeah.
So 10 years ago. Um, I think it's really good to put this right back in people's faces
Yeah.
right now. And I mean, even you said you wanted it to be flashy. I mean, the cover's even yellow. Um, like it's
Warning,
very
warning.
flashy. Yeah. And I think that's a good thing. But have you seen people? Well, you've actually mentioned already, people don't read it and they just start arguing with you. What is your response? Do you just tell them to read it? Do you?
I mean, you want to, right? Just say, hey,
Right.
we'll just read it first. But no, I think I always try and, you've seen a bunch of my social media stuff. I mean,
Mhm.
I try to honestly engage with folks if they're honest about having a conversation. But more and more, I'm seeing this real antagonism and snark and just trolling behavior, even from a bunch of folks who I respect, who I thought were, invested in scholarship seriously.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think there's just the divisions now are very harsh. And so I try to always respond respectfully and sort of point to, okay, here's the disagreement, here's the data, here's some papers, here's some, I'm always putting links to papers and articles and things like
Right.
that. And
Right.
but at some point you have to just stop, because some people just don't, they just want to fight about it, or they're just
Mhm.
true believers in some whatever they're arguing, and they're not ready to do a scientific analysis, right? They're not ready to really consider respectfully and carefully what's going on. So sometimes you just have to say, well, fine, you say whatever you want to say. But I think
Right.
in many
Right.
cases people are actually interested in what's out there. And
Mhm.
that's why there's data out there. You just have to work, you have to do a lot of reading and learning and careful learning, and I think that's really difficult for people, right?
Now, why
It's a
don't you
lot.
real quickly, because that was, I think that was a great verbiage that you used, careful learning.
Yeah.
Why don't you expand on that? What is careful learning?
So we're all biased, right? Being humans comes with bias. That's who we are. That's how it works, right? I mean, I talk about that in the book. We are who we meet, right? Who we grew up with, and those kinds of things. We're influenced. So careful reading means paying attention to what you're reading, but also paying attention to what you're bringing to that reading, right?
Mhm.
What do you already believe to be true about the world? Why do you believe that? How is that shaping your interpretations? I use the example in the book of me and a colleague many years ago, sitting in this watching some monkeys, a group of macaques doing some behavior, and we're both standing right next to each other. We see the exact same behavior. We turn to each other and we describe two different things. And it was not, in general, but we explained it in totally different ways because of our
Right. Right.
training and our orientations and stuff like that. And so careful reading is bringing that to your reading, right? So recognizing how you might be filtering that information. So that's one thing. The second thing about careful reading is to sort of pay attention to what the author is trying to say, not what you think they should be saying, right? Actually
Good
listening to
point.
the author. I
Yeah.
find, and so I read and review a lot of things I really disagree with, but I absolutely try to understand what the author's saying and what their goal is in my assessments of the information. And so I think that's really important. And I guess there's a whole bunch of other things, but the final thing I would say is that careful reading also involves like really thinking about something when you read it, not
Mhm.
just sort of, I hate this, I like this, whatever, really letting, spending some time with it. And, that's hard. Who has the time to do all this kind of stuff? And nowadays there's so much out there of, careful reading now. Every time I read something I'm interested in, I find six or seven, if it's a journal article or
Right.
something, I find six or
Right.
seven citations that I have to go and get and read. I mean, I have thousands upon thousands of PDFs in folders marked,
Yeah.
read this, read this.
Oh, yeah. Now, since you mentioned that a lot of people don't have time for this, are there any plans for an audiobook in the future?
So it's funny you should say that. I wanted to do an audiobook for this right away. I did the audiobook for my 2017 The Creative Spark, and I really had a
Right.
great time doing it.
Loved
So
it, by the way.
oh,
Loved
thanks,
it.
thanks. I appreciate it. It was what a wonderful learning experience doing the audiobook, and how difficult it is. I have so much respect for the voice actors who do this.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But I was just contacted recently by UC Press saying that they are now going to
Mm.
sell the rights to Audible to do
Oh.
an audio version. So an audio version will be coming out. I don't know if I'll do it or who will do it. I don't know if I get that option, but hopefully it will be done, because that's another great. I think audiobooks are fantastic
Yeah,
because it gives
definitely.
that time and that access. And I mean, I tried in this second edition to write it a little bit. My initial writing, the initial book, was always for, a broader audience, but here I tried even
Mhm.
more to be a little bit better about my verbiage and my rattling along there, because there's so much data and so much information. I try to make it also with current examples and a little bit more of an engaging tone. So,
And that's
hopefully.
one thing that I loved about the book was you did give, so here's the issue. Here's an example pretty much anyone can understand. Here's the counter argument to that issue. And here's, well, you can kind of decide what you want to think, but here's why you should think this. And
Right,
I think
right.
that format is really effective. And especially for people who are very unfamiliar with these issues, um, I think it's very enlightening if they take it slowly, like you said. Um, but if you do read it too fast and I mean, just from the title, I'm sure so many people have called you quite a few things. But if you actually pay attention to it, there is so much to learn in this book, and I do highly recommend it to anyone. And I mean, I did not read the original. I was not into anthropology 10 years ago. Um, I, but I would you recommend rereading?
Yeah. I mean, rereading, like if you read the
Like,
original,
yeah,
reading this one,
yeah.
yes. Yeah. Because like I changed a lot in there. There's a lot of the core is the same. But I added a lot, changed a lot, updated a lot, and actually I think made some of the arguments better. And some of the
Mhm.
areas where I don't think as clear, effective, or as accurate as I could have been, I tried to improve all those areas as well. So, I mean, it was a joy to,
Yeah,
do this huge project and get it out into the world, and then a decade later have the opportunity to make it better. I mean,
right,
that's like
definitely.
a scholar's dream, right? I wish I could go back and fix tons of stuff I did 20 years ago. That'd be fantastic.
Yeah, I'm sure. So the book is out now. I don't remember exactly when it came out. How is
I think in May.
reception in May? Okay. How has this time around's reception been?
Well, it's actually really interesting because it's a second edition, so most places don't review, like public places don't review
Oh,
second editions. New York Times,
okay.
I mean, just journals. I think this will be reviewed in like the American Journal of Biological Anthropology or American Anthropologist or something like that. So it'll be reviewed in the scholarly journals. But when the first one came out, it got a lot of press, right? A lot of stuff. I
Right.
did a lot of radio shows. There weren't as many podcasts then. Some TV stuff, and it really it had a very broad public splash, right? Because this is a
Mhm.
second edition, this won't have that. But it was
Mhm.
really interesting
Okay.
because then I got, for the first year of the book being out, I got a lot of positive feedback, and a lot of universities began using it for like fresh intro classes, or the intro reading for the year, stuff like that, which was great. I mean, I was so happy at that. But I also got a lot of haters. I mean, I would get people
Yeah,
emailing me, calling me, death threats. It was this weird, like,
I'm sure.
people just lose their stuff over this. And it's usually, I mean, not always, but usually guys who are just really pissed off at the race stuff or the sex stuff.
Yeah.
And some people who didn't like the aggression, violence stuff, but they're just people who are so committed to the world being one way, their racist and sexist reality, that when people publicly push against it, um, they get so angry, just really angry. That was real surprising, and I still get that from a lot of my other work, but it's just always
Right.
surprising how just how hate filled some people are.
Which I think is why the book exists in some ways. Um, so they're kind of living the the ideas that you're putting in the book, the negative ideas that are in the book.
Yeah.
And I'm
Yeah,
sorry you've had to deal with that, but
no, no, no. It's, I mean, that's it's par for the course, and that's not
yeah,
an issue. If it gets more people to read it, or it gets even a few people who are maybe buying into certain things because of ignorance, they just haven't had access to or thought about things in
right,
certain ways. If it gets those people the knowledge, then that's fantastic. Well, it's, everyone invokes Martin Luther King's quote that the arc bends towards social justice, towards justice, right?
hmm,
Arcs, future trajectories, anything only bend when you push them, right? And so
right,
knowledge is power, but only if you use it, right? And so people have to have
exactly,
access to knowledge, and that's the, like, I think my biggest frustration. And I think the society's huge dilemma right now is there's all this information out there, but there's so much misinformation in front of it that it's really
right,
hard to get
right.
people good understandings of what it means to be human.
And I mean, we're already going back to banning books and information. You better get it while it's out there.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's terrifying. Like, for example, I'm pretty sure a bunch of stuff that's verified, published in peer-reviewed journals, that's in the book. I'm sure the way I frame it and put it out, it's probably illegal in Florida now.
Oh, 100%. 100%. Which, I mean, if you think about it, is bad, but it's also kind of cool, I guess. If it's like, hey, I wrote some banned books,
Yeah,
but
I wish it wasn't that case, though. But I
I
mean,
know.
the interesting thing, though, is I'm hoping that at least this gives books notoriety, or gives
Yeah,
face to a lot of issues that people. I'm still trying to be optimistic, right? That there's,
right.
I think,
Yeah.
more people who care out there than people who don't. But it's tough.
I've seen so far with a lot of the popular titles that have been banned, they become kind of what you said, they even like rise to like a legend tier
Yeah,
of
yeah,
like, we need to grab all of these. Like, honestly, and I kind of feel bad about this being from a Jewish background, I had never heard of the comic and Mouse.
mouse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd never heard of it. And I heard what was happening with it, and I went and bought a copy. I'm like, I'm not gonna, if they find me, I want them to find me with a copy of it, you know? um, so yeah, there's definitely this stage that's been set, and it's gonna
Yeah.
be interesting to see what happens. But
Mouse is a great graphic novel. It's really
yeah,
worthwhile. And there's, I think that's another. So the graphic novel is such a great delivery mechanism. I think it's a great way to tell stories. Yeah,
mhm.
I mean, I'd love to do a graphic novel of parts of this. I don't know if it's possible, but yeah, yeah, I'd love to see. Would be a great graphic novel that I haven't seen yet, is a human evolution graphic novel. That would
Wouldn't
be
it? Wouldn't
that would
it?
be like, as an intro class, that I would totally teach that. That would be fantastic.
I mean, I know that some of the people on Dr. Berger's team got comics made of them,
Yeah, yeah,
and they have something going on with that. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I know there's some work in
yeah.
making graphic novels for human evolution.
I,
So,
I think that would be fantastic. Well, but that just gets to this sort of whole thing that we're talking about, is getting the information out there. How do you get
mhm.
knowledge into people's hands, right? So I'm really glad, and hopefully schools will continue to use my book, in answer departments, or in social departments, psych, what have you. But I would love it if people actually just read it from, got it from the library, or even purchased a
Yeah.
copy off of the UC Press website or Amazon or whatever. Just, but it's hard. It's hard. And part of the problem with my writing in this context is that I'm a trained, as an anthropologist, and I it's hard to be really simplistic about stuff. So as I
Right.
said, you have to do, I'm like, look, this is really complicated. Look how complicated it is, and I sort of lay it all out. And
Yeah.
my fear is always that, you lose people. People are like, but like this other side is so easy to understand, right? It's like black, white,
Right.
male, female, we're
Definitely.
done, it's over. So we're always fighting this uphill battle with, reality's really complicated and messy, and a lot of falsehoods. These myths are very simple, right, and clean, and people, I think, gravitate towards simplicity sometimes just because it's easier to be with.
Most definitely. I think something happened along, our trajectory, probably within the last few hundred years, where we just kind of lost a lot of our interests in the world around us. And everything just kind of, like you said, has become black and white and binary. And I mean, I guess probably since the Victorian era, things have been that way.
Well, but I mean,
Yeah.
that's another reason, and I say this early on in the book. I opened the book in a way that I got criticized early on for being arrogant and obnoxious, and maybe I am, but not. This is not what this happens in the book. I open it with talking about myself, my life experience,
Right.
my
Right.
travels, these kind, because I think it's so important for the reader to know who's writing this, right? To know who I am
Exactly.
and what my biases are. But I say in there, one of the things that I've been so privileged in throughout my life is to have traveled an enormous amount my entire life
Right.
around the planet to different places, different countries, different languages. And what it always reminds me is that this like what's right here,
Uh-huh.
for example, in the US right now, or, you're on the West Coast, I'm on the East Coast, like these little places we live are not typical of all humans on the planet,
Oh,
right?
100%.
And
I
this
assume
whole
it's
idea
very
that
rare. Yeah.
there are many successful ways to do this human thing, and I think
Mhm.
the more people know that, the easier it is to deal with diversity, the easier it is to understand people who have a different opinion or belief system than you. So I think the world would be a better place if everyone just had to travel a bit, right? Just to see how people live around the world. So I just think that's really important, because we tend to think, like in the US, we tend to think everything surrounds just us, and there's a lot of problems here, so we need to focus on it. But there are people dealing with these same kinds of things in other ways, in other places, sometimes doing it really well, sometimes doing it worse. But understanding that, or knowing that, I think is important, and that's what I try to do with the book. It's like, look, here's a whole bunch of biological, evolutionary, psychological information about diversity in humans. Here's how we need to think about it.
100%. And this makes me think of a documentary that I just saw that I'm wondering if you've seen, called, where was it? It's just called Human,
Hmm.
by Jan Arthus Bertrand.
Oh no.
It's a very like cinematographic film, but it's about, the whole thing's just a set of interviews.
Hmm.
And from like, what is love, what is poverty, what is hope, and he
Oh,
just interviews these people, and it's all in their native language, so it makes it feel much more like you're actually hearing from them. And it was I sent it to a few people, and they said it changed the way they view what being human is.
oh, that's fantastic. Well, I got to check this out. So it's just called
Yeah,
Human.
and it's free on YouTube, and I think it's
Oh,
that
cool.
way because they wanted it public, because you go to their website and it's just a YouTube link.
Oh, that's
Um,
great.
so, and he has a few other documentaries that aren't free, so I really think this one was meant to be for everyone.
That's great, and
But
it sounds very
yeah,
much like what I was saying, just about just seeing how many ways there are to do this human thing. I think that's fantastic, and
exactly.
and that's also, one of the reasons I wrote this book. And I have the title. I say race, monogamy, and other lies they told you. What I'm really talking about is the lies about homogeneity, right? That
Mhm.
human bodies, human lives are really quite diverse, and understanding the biological and cultural and psychological and historical processes behind that's important. And I think seeing that there's many ways that humans are. We all know this, right? We experience that,
Right,
but we try to close it down, right? Culturally, you're sort of told, no, there's only one right way to be human. And
definitely.
so that's the myth, right? That there's actually a lot of successful ways to be human, and knowing a little bit more about that, I think, helps us all be a little bit better with ourselves and with everyone else.
And I think that's an excellent point. And that phrase that you mentioned, there's multiple ways to be human. is a very powerful statement that I think needs to be on, you know, what are they called? Billboards and things like that, just all over the place. There's multiple ways to be human. There's multiple ways to be human. I think, like you said, if everyone just went from a base of there's multiple ways to be human, which is why you started your book that way, um, this world would be so much easier to navigate.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Well, and it's amazing because if you talk with, if you like hang out with 5 or 6 or 7 year olds, right? We hang out with a bunch of
mhm,
kids. They don't actually have any problem with that. That's easy when you're a
right,
child, right? It's easier. It varies in different societies, what have you, but on average, kids don't
mhm,
like you can bring to them something new or different or some context, and they don't lose their minds. They're like, oh, hey, cool, on average. Whereas as you grow
right,
up, that openness to the world gets sort of closed down, and that's part of
mhm,
enculturation. That's part of training. Every society does that, but we lose a lot, right? We lose a lot in that moment. We don't just lose sort of perspective. We actually lose neurodiversity. We lose experiential possibilities. We lose the ability to live with ourselves in some ways because a lot of people mature and find out they're not exactly who they thought they were, right? Or they don't
right,
map to a particular expectation of them by society. And to
exactly.
understand that that's a possible normal range of being human, that's important, right?
100 million%. And being with a partner who went through that and grew up to be someone they thought they weren't, I can definitely speak to the transformation of finally accepting that and
Yeah.
coming into the person you're supposed to be. And if people would just let people do that, it'd be a much more beautiful world, I think.
And there's no, I mean, there's great evidence historically and cross culturally of different societies doing this in different ways. So I don't think there's one right way to do it. And there's a lot of bad ways to do it, a lot of harmful ways.
Right.
But
Right.
we can learn, I think, just and that's I guess one thing where I am optimistic is like, my students in classrooms, 20-year-olds today, on average, at least in the US, in Europe, and actually recently I was talking with students in Kenya and also in South Africa,
Mhm.
and in Mexico, just thinking of the places I've been sort of right around pre-COVID or what have you. Um, I see there's a bit more of an openness to variation and diversity in identity, variation, diversity in perspective. There seems to me a little hope there, right?
Mhm.
I could
Definitely.
just be fooling myself, but I seem to think, right, you younger folks are a little bit more like, hey, this is cool, as opposed to, no, you can't be that way.
I would 100% agree with that, and it's just the part of that that's scary is our generation's not the ones making the rules.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
as we
Yeah.
just saw Roe versus Wade, they're kind of thinking they're going to be going after
Yeah. Yeah.
LGBTQIA rights next, and this whole generation. I mean, I honestly don't think they're going to sit for it.
Yeah.
I
Well,
don't
I
know
hope
what
not.
that
Well,
means.
but that's, I mean, that's also incumbent upon my generation, for example,
Yeah,
to
yeah,
especially those of us like me with privilege, right? I'm a
right.
tenured full professor, right? That's why I try at least to yell, to act, to affect change. People my age should
Yeah,
be doing more of that, right? It's interesting. I see the real activists, the real action is coming from much younger folks, which is great. That's a common way, but those with power should be pushing harder in the academy, in public life. And I just wish our politicians, the folks who represent people, were just doing this much more effectively.
yeah, exactly. I wish they would represent the people they're representing. Is
Well,
the
we
best
have
way to put
that's
that. Yeah.
that's another place where careful reading. Like I am just shocked at how when I get into conversations with folks around the United States, how little people seem to know about how our government works, how government works in the
Mhm.
US. I mean, this is sort of off topic, but it's also back to that careful reading. It's like knowledge is
Right.
really important. And I think if more people knew how things worked, I think we'd have a better sort of participatory democracy. I think people would be more engaged. I think so many people feel just like, well, I don't know, there's nothing I
Yeah.
could do that would make a difference. And that's, the same thing about why I want people to read this book. It's like with a little bit of knowledge, next time you're at a, party, or, hanging out in a classroom or with family or something, and someone says something that is wrong and harmful and even hateful, if you have a little bit of knowledge, you can sort of interject and say, hey, you know what, I don't think that's true, and here's why. And those kinds of things, even those small actions, are actually quite powerful. People don't have to do it all the time, but more often than not, people shouldn't let horrible things happen if they can help avoid them.
Most definitely. And I think that almost goes with the title, just the title part of your other book, Creative Spark. If you get a spark in someone, I really think it'll just, even if it does a little bit, just a
Right.
spark to get them going is what's needed. Because so many people walk around happily living in the society that they're born in, not really, like you said, thinking about how things work and whether or not it's bad or good for people who aren't them. I
Right.
think a lot of
Right.
people are very stuck in, well, I'm okay, so everything's okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And that's what I'm trying to sort of point out in this book. No, everything's not okay, but we do have knowledge, and that's why my area, I'm a scholar, right? I'm a scientist, an anthropologist, a researcher. What I really have to offer is like, look, here's a bunch of knowledge, here's a bunch of information, here's a bunch of data. And so the spark, right, that you mentioned, is I'm trying to say, look, that you can have this knowledge, do with it what you will, but you at least have it. Once you have it, it hopefully changes you a little bit. And I think that's that sort of power, because as I said, we started this conversation off talking about bias, and like we're all in our own sort of bubbles of our lived experience, and understanding a little bit, breaking a little bit outside of that, gives you so much better possibilities, right, for understanding the world, and dealing with others. And that's why data, just talking about human biological variation, like understanding how our bodies vary, understanding how sort of societies think about that variation or don't think about it, is it's really important.
yeah, it's very important. It's, yeah. And how, off the top of your head, and you might not have an answer for this. So there, obviously, a lot of cultures are drastically different from the way we live in America. When you're talking about something like monogamy, what would you say the percentage of the world is that's just monogamy was not the first thing they were taught?
Well, I mean, I think that the weirdest part of that phrase is most people have no idea what monogamy is. They have this sort of notion
Exactly.
that this is this sort of like natural state where there's usually, they think about it as a heterosexual couple comes together and stays together and produces children as a sort of nexus, right? So really,
Mhm.
when most people think monogamy, they think of this nuclear family unit, right? Well, first of all,
Right.
that is not, we know, historically, evolutionarily, cross-culturally, the nuclear family unit is atypical for humans. It's usually much broader, extended family with a variety of other things like that. But this whole idea of monogamy, and the reason I call it a lie and say it's dangerous, is not because monogamy isn't something that humans do. That is, spending lots of time in very close, strong bonds with one other individual, right? Heterosexually, homosexually, can change back and forth across time. That happens, right? Humans do have these very deep, strong bonds, but they don't entail this whole package of all this other stuff. And I think that's the harm. The lie is that there's one person out there for everyone, and if you'll, find that person, you'll, marry them and have 2.5 kids and half a dog and a picket fence, or so, that
Half a
whole
dog.
package, of well, they always say on average you'll have 2.5 kids, right?
I
Like
know.
you can't have half a
I
kid and half a
know.
dog. But this whole idea is that yes, humans pair bond. We form these incredibly tight, deep, caring relationships. But this stuff with monogamy, the way people talk about it or assume it is this whole other package of cultural stereotypes. Um,
Mhm.
and what happens when people don't get that, or because that's not actually standard today. Um, it's hard, right? People get depressed. People feel they're missing out. People feel like it's not connected. People could have multiple bonds, strong pair bonds across their lives, or they could have just one. I mean, there's a whole bunch of ways. There's also incredible bonding that has nothing to do with sexual relationships.
Right.
So, there's all of this complexity. So here, my sort of argument against monogamy is not that people don't pair bond and stay together. It's that the package of cultural assumptions around it are just not true for the vast majority of humans. And if we hold that up as the ideal, like you said, right, you're taught and you grow
Mhm.
up in this society, you're taught here's the ideal. And if you don't achieve that ideal, then you've failed. Well, that's ridiculous because
Right.
that's not even the typical reality for humans. So
And that failure and that fear of failure, I think, is very pervasive in cultures like
yeah,
ours,
yeah,
where again, if you don't meet those standards, you're gonna be depressed, you're gonna have other issues. It's just a
yeah,
whole circle of not greatness.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. And I think that's the same too when we think about bodies, right? Like what are bodies
you
supposed
went
to be like? What is
silent
biological
for
variation?
right now. I don't
Oops,
know what happened.
did you just lose me?
Oh, my Siri is trying to listen to me. That might be
Oh,
why. Let me. Yes, I know you didn't get it, Siri. Thank you. Please. Oh my God, it said you're welcome.
can you hear?
Okay. Yes, now I can hear you. I don't know what it must have thought I called. It must have thought I summoned it, and you went silent for a little bit.
The Siri demon always freaks me out. That's just a weird. And so it's like people think it's a familiar, but I think it's one of those evil familiars that's actually demonically controlling you. So
So what were you saying? I'm sorry.
no, what were we saying? The monogamy. Oh yeah, no, it's just this. It's not even just about monogamy or sort of the ideal of relationships, but it's also like understanding the variation, typical variation of human bodies. Like, what is that like? What does that look like? We don't even think about that, right? And
Right.
there's a strong movement, at least, especially with youth today, to say, okay, well, there's lots of right ways to be bodied, right? And there's lots of diversity, and we know that. And so human biological diversity is enormous. And so having an understanding of actually what human biology is like and what those patterns are helps with that too, because what if you don't have the body that you're supposed to, or you don't fit into the masculine or feminine stereotypes that you're supposed to? That's okay.
Right.
That's part of being human. And if we understand that, we can bust these myths of human nature that says we're this way or this way or this way.
And I think that is a beautiful way to cap off this introduction to this book, which if you'd hold it up one more time so we can see it, because I really want people to be looking for this book and to be getting it because it's great. Um, Definitely a great read. But
Well,
I think, yeah, that is where we will call it, unless you have anything else you'd like to say and finish off with.
no, I just, I hope people do read it and enjoy it. And as I said, I like to hear from people who've read it. So I'm always open for input and feedback.
All right. And there we have it, Professor Dr. Augustine Fuentes. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for watching this episode of The Story of Us. I hope you had an amazing time and learning experience. My guests and I had a great time putting this together for your enjoyment. I hope that you learned something and that there's always more to learn. If you would like to watch our previous episodes, please view them on my YouTube channel or my website, which is listed in the description below. And please subscribe and like to not miss future episodes. Thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day.